Good morning, dear students. So today actually we are going to discuss British poetry and the block number 5th that has got uh, modern poetry actually. So we would like to discuss various facets of the modern poetry and how it developed and what are the main poets actually and how it bent. So in our last sessions, we were talking about romantic poetry, and then we were talking about Victorian period, and then actually we were talking about the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and then comes modern poetry. So in romantic movement, we tried to understand how you see the movement bent actually with the publication of lyrical ballads and how it was helped by William Wordsworth and Ashley Coleridge, and then you see William Wordsworth was the poet laureate till 1850, and then there was a vacuum on the stage of English poetry. And Alfred Lord Tennyson was made the poet laureate, and then Victorian era started, the Victorian age started, and you see in between we see actually the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the poetry composed by D.G. Rossetti and Christiana Rossetti and other poets. Then actually now we have with us modern poetry, and we would like to understand the streams and the phases and the main poets and their literary works in the modern poetry. We would also like to understand the flows and those actually special works that were done, that were composed during modern poetry. So modernist poetry in English started in the early years of the 20th century with the appearance of the Imagists. As soon as the Imagist poets came into appearance, and then actually the modern poetry started in common with many other modernists. These poets wrote in reaction to the perceived excesses of Victorian poetry, with its emphasis on traditional formalism and ornate diction. In many respects, their criticism echoes what William Wordsworth wrote in Preface to Lyrical Ballads to instigate the romantic movement in British poetry over a century earlier, criticizing the pompous school which then pervaded and seeking to bring poetry to the layman. So the modern poetry and the modern poets were actually, they were influenced by many movements, as a matter of fact, in which the romantic movement is one, and then actually the traditional formalism is another, and they were actually they were influenced by the Imagist kind of poetry also. On the other hand, modern poetry seeks to develop, seeks to portray the problems and the dilemmas of the common people, the common layman, and it talks about their problems and you see their dilemmas of life. And then you see modern poets particularly saw themselves as looking back to the best practices of poets in earlier periods and other cultures. Their models included ancient Greek literature. Their models, it means actually the modern poetry included very much the ancient Greek literature, Chinese and Japanese poetry, the Tarvadruas, Dante, and the medieval Italian philosophical poets, and the English metaphysical poets. So as we were talking, my dear friends, in the earlier slide also, in our in the beginning of the modernist poetry, we were talking that you see these poets took motivation, they were influenced by, you see, different kinds of ages, different kinds of movements, in which you see Japanese poetry was there, and the Chinese poetry was there, and of course Greek literature was also there. They were very much influenced with the philosophy of Dante, and they were influenced by Italian philosophical poets and English metaphysical poets also. So they actually got influenced from different kinds of poets and different kinds of movements in the modernist poetry. Then The roots of English language poetic modernism can be traced back to the works of a number of earlier writers, including Walt Whitman, whose long lines approached the type of free verse, the prose poetry of Oscar Wilde, Robert Browning's subversion of the poetic self, Emily Dickinson's compression, and the writings of the early English symbolists, especially Arthur Symons. So as we were talking that the modern poetry actually, the elements of the modern poetry can be found in the works of Walt Whitman, can be found in the works and poetry of Oscar Wilde and Robert Browning's, poetic sensibility. So there actually the elements of the modern poetry can be also found in Emily Dickinson's works and other symbolists' work like Arthur Symons, etc. So as we were talking that the modern poetry was a fine amalgamation, it was a fine mixture of the different movements, and it was a fine mixture of the feelings and the sensibilities of the different poets from different literatures. However, these poets essentially remain true to the basic tenets of the Romantic movement, and the appearance of the Imagists marked the first emergence of distinctly modernist poetic in the language. So as we were talking actually, that intrinsically these modern poets were very much dedicated to the Romantic movement and the Imagist kind of poetry. But you see, outwardly, they were influenced by different kinds of movements and the different kinds of poets. From there, they took inspiration, they took, the subjects and the subject matters and their themes in order to write different kinds of poems and different kinds of literary works. And then the modernist revolution of the word was not universally welcomed, either by readers or writers. Certainly by the 1930s, a new generation of poets had emerged who looked to more formally conservative poets like Thomas Hardy and W.B. Yeats as a models, and these writers struck a chord with the readership who were uncomfortable with the experimentation and uncertainty preferred by the modernists. So as we were talking actually, the word modernism, the word modern poetry, it was not very much welcomed. It was not, the idea was not very much liked by the, writers at the time and even by the readers that time. So what actually the most of the people and then the new generation of the poets, they started following Thomas Hardy and W.B. Yeats for their models and for their designs, for their ideas, for their themes, for their, central themes to write and compose poems actually. So, notwithstanding modernist poetry cannot be positively characterized, there being no mainstream or dominant mode. So, as a matter of fact, as we were talking, the modern poetry actually, at one point of time, the poets and the writers of the modern period, they were influenced by the different writers and from the different ages also. But later actually the poets, did not like that idea, and they did not like the idea at all of the modernism, and they were, very much, they were very much devoted to the themes and the ideas of Mr. Hardy and W.B. Yeats. And this is how actually they started taking the ideas from these two great giants of English literature of modern period. However, in the 1950s, saw the emergence, particularly in the United States, of a new generation of poets who looked to the modernists for inspiration. The influence of modernism can be seen in these poetic groups and movements, especially those associated with the San Francisco Renaissance, the Beat generation, the Black Mountain poets, and the Deep Image groups. So, the new generation poets actually, they started taking, particularly from the United States actually, they started taking the inspiration from the modern period actually. And you see, gradually the influence of the modern period, the influence of the modern sensibility, the influence of the modernist poetry could be seen everywhere onto the different poetic groups, onto the different, you see, genres actually. And especially particularly the writers and the group of the writers, those who were associated with the San Francisco Renaissance and the Beat Generation poets and the Black Mountain poets, and these people were, you see, very much inclined, they were very much influenced by the activities of the modern poetry and the modernist groups. Charles Olson, the theorist of the Black Mountain group, wrote in his 1950 essay, Projectivist Verse, One perception must immediately and directly lead to further perception. A statement that links back directly to the imagists. Robert Duncan, another Black Mountain poet, admired H.D., while a third member of the group, Robert Creeley, did much to help revive interest in other objectivists. So this is how actually the modern poetry, you see, gradually was becoming famous, and it was actually holding its roots and its place and land. Among the Beats, Gary Sander and Allen Ginsberg studied Pound closely and were heavily influenced by his interest in Chinese and Japanese poetry and the ecological concerns evident in later cantos. So among these people actually, Gray Sander and Allen Ginsberg, they studied Ezra Pound's poetry very clearly, and they were very much influenced. They developed their interest in Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry. And later on, William Carlos Williams was another person who had a strong impact on the Beat poets, encouraging poets like Lew Belch and writing an introduction for the book publication of Ginsberg's seminal poem. However, many of these writers found a major platform for their work in Sid Corman, Origin magazines and press. Origin also published work by Lewis, Lauren, Negdecker, and Wallace Stevens, helping to revive interest in these early modernist writers. To objectivists, especially the strict formal experimentation of Geoffsky's later works, but also formative for the language poets. So this is how we were, you see, these people helped a lot for the development of the modernist poetry, and gradually it started becoming famous. As the Beats and the American poets began to find readers in the United Kingdom and Ireland, a new generation of British poets with an interest in modernist experimentation began to appear. So this is how actually you see slightly and gradually you see the Beats and other American poets started becoming famous in United Kingdom and Ireland, and the new generation poets of the Britain, they also started taking an interest in their modern poetry. So a new era began, a new experimentation began, and you see these people started experimenting on their poetry, and this was a fine amalgamation, this was a fine mixture of both of the poetic sensibilities, both of the poetic, you see, themes and critical waves. These poets who included Tom Raworth, Bob Gobbing, and Turnbull, and others formed the nucleus of the British poetry revival. This new generation helped bring about a renewable interest in the writings of Bunting, MacDiarmid, David Jones, and David Gascoigne. Current practices includes the enormously influential canon of Roy Fisher, also a major player in the revival. So this is how, my dear friends, as we have seen, you see the poetry of the American poets, those who were associated with the Beats movement and others, also started becoming famous in, you see, in the areas of the British literary circles, and then actually they started getting a moment there. So this was a very good phase. It was a sign for the development of the modern poetry, and this is how the modern poetry developed a lot. Contemporary poets associated with Irish modernism include those associated with New Writers Press and the View magazine. These include Trevor Joyce, Michael Smith, Geoffrey Squires, Randolph Haley, Willie Millis, Catherine Walsh, and Maurice Scully. So you see, these contemporary poets, and some of them were associated with the Irish modernism movement, and you see, these were maximally these were the poets from United States, and the New Writers Press also published work by Thomas McGreevy, Brian Coffey, and Dennis Devlin, introducing them to a new audience, and in Coffey's case, facilitating a late flooring of new work. So this is how, my dear friends, actually the group of American poets was very much active, and they did a lot for the development of the modernist poetry through their various works and through their literary journals and magazines. They tried to create an awareness for the development of the modern poetry. Among them, these Joyce, Michael Smith, Geoffrey Squires, Randolph Haley, Billy Millis were very important actually. And these people did a lot. As we see, the modern poetry, the modernist poetry, we see the poetry in its modern sense. We cannot forget to take the name of a great poet, William Butler Yeats. He was a real poet, a first-rate poet of the modern period. He was born on 13th June 1865 and died on 28th January 1939, was an Irish poet, one of the foremost figures of 20th century literature. There are very few names who can be counted along with William Butler Yeats, a shining name of modern literature, a pillar of both the Irish and British literary establishments. In his later years, he served as an Irish senator for 2 terms. Yeats was a driving force behind the Irish literary revival, along with Lady Gregory, Edward Martyn, and others. Founded the Abbey Theatre, where he served as its chief during its early years. So, as we can see, my dear friends, in the slide, he was the leading figure of the modern poetry, and he was an Irishman. He was a driving force. He was the main motivational force behind the Irish literary revival, along with Lady Gregory and others. And he was also there in order to develop the Abbey Theatre. He developed the Abbey Theatre. There many activities were carried out. So during the modern period, William Butler Yeats did a lot for the development of the modern poetry and the development for the poetry also. In 1923, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature as the first Irishman so honored for what the Nobel Committee described as inspired poetry, which in a highly artistic form gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation. So we were talking that you see these people tried to, William Butler Yeats tried to influence the scene of the modern poetry, and for that he was given the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the first Irishman who was given the Nobel Prize for Literature. Till today, he is remembered for his poetic collections, for his best kind of poetry, and he was very much associated with Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore also. And he was the one who wrote the introduction to Gitanjali, and because of the, you see, so many requests of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, William Butler Yeats tried to read Upanishads and Vedas of Indian culture. So he had an understanding towards Indian culture, and this is how he tried to write. That you see the introduction of Gitanjali. Yeats is generally considered one of the few writers who completed their greatest works after being awarded the Nobel Prize. Such works include The Tower 1928, and The Binding Stair and Other Poems, 1928. So, you see, even after getting the Nobel Prize for Literature, he was still very famous, and still he was able to write very good poetry and so many books for the development of English literature and the modern poetry. Yeats was a very good friend of American expatriate poet and Bollingen Prize laureate Ezra Pound. Yeats wrote the introduction for Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, as we were discussing, my dear friend, which was published by the India Society. So, it was Yeats who introduced, you see, Rabindranath Tagore to the international audience, to the international, you see, group of poets, and thereafter, actually, you see, Gurudev got the Nobel Prize much earlier than W.B. Yeats could get. So, you see, there was an associationship, there was a deep understanding between Gurudev Tagore and William Butler Yeats. And you see, William Butler Yeats had a very good companionship, very good friendship with Ezra Pound, a leading American poet of the contemporary time. He was born in Dublin and educated there, and in London he spent his childhood holidays in country Sligo, studied poetry in his youth, and from an early age was fascinated by both Irish legends and the occult. So as we were talking that, you see, basically he was an Ironman and he spent a lot of time in London, and you see, he went to the country Sligo for his holidays, and then you see he studied poetry in his youth age and at the early age also. He was very much fascinated by the Irish tales and the Irish culture and tradition. So, you see, that is why he had a deep interest for the development of the Irish culture and Irish literature. He had a deep feeling for the development of the Irish, you see, culture and traditions, and that is why, you see, he gave a lot, and he did a lot for the development of the Irish movement. Those topics feature in the first phase of his work, which lasted roughly until the turn of the 20th century. His earliest volume of verse was published in 1889, and its slow-paced and lyrical poems display Yeats' debts to Edmund Spenser, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the poets of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So, he actually he took the motivation in order to write his poetry from Spenser, from Shelley, and the poets of the Pre-Raphaelite movement actually. From 19th century, Yeats' poetry grew more physical and realistic. He largely renounced the transcendental beliefs of his youth, though he remained preoccupied with physical and spiritual masks as well as with cynical theories of life. So, as we can see, my dear friends, that he did a lot in order to develop the modern poetry. Very dedicated poet he was, and he took the inspiration for writing poetry from the leading artists like Edmund Spenser, P.B. Shelley, and the different poets of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood like D.G. Rossetti and Christiana Rossetti, etc. Abbey Theatre. In 1899, Yeats, Lady Gregory, Edward Martyn, and George Moore established the Irish Literary Theatre for the purpose of performing Irish and Celtic plays. The ideals of the Abbey Theatre derived from the avant-garde French theatre, which sought to express the ascendancy of the playwright rather than the actor-manager. The group's manifesto, which Yeats wrote, declared, "We hope to find in Ireland an uncorrupted and imaginative audience trained to listen by its passion for oratory, and that freedom to experiment which is not found in the theatres of England, and without which no new movement in art or literature can succeed." So, as we were talking, that this Abbey Theatre particularly was for the development of the Irish culture and the Irish, you see, tradition. So, these people actually, along with Lady Gregory, William Yeats, and others, actually tried to help the development of Irish and Celtic languages, and this is how it was established. The collectives survived for about 2 years but was not successful. Working with two Irish brothers with theatrical experience, William and Frank Fay, Yeats' unpaid yet independently wealthy secretary, Annie Horniman, and the leading West End actress, Florence Fair, the group established the Irish National Theatre Society. Along with Synge, they acquired property in Dublin and on 27th December 1904 opened the Abbey Theatre. Yeats remained involved with the Abbey until his death, both as a member of the board and a prolific playwright. So you see, it was an effort by Yeats, and he was there actually from beginning to the last. T.S. Eliot, my dear friends, another very important name in the poetry of the modern age. Thomas Streins Eliot. He was born in 1888 and died on 1965, was an essayist, publisher, playwright, literary and social critic, and one of the 20th century's major poets. Born at St. Louis, Missouri, in the United Kingdom States, he moved to the United Kingdom in 1914 at the age of 25 and was naturalized as a British subject in 1927 at the age 39. So T.S. Eliot, my dear friends, he was born in the United States and then came back to United Kingdom, and there he actually wrote the best of the best, his works there. Wasteland was also written and composed there. Eliot attracted widespread attention for his poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, that was published in 1915, which is seen as a masterpiece of the modernist movement. It was followed by some of the best known poems in the English language, including The Wasteland, The Hollow Man, Ash Wednesday, and Four Quartets. He is also known for his 7 plays, particularly Murder in the Cathedral, that was published in 1935. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948 for his outstanding pioneer contribution to present-day poetry. So as we were talking, my dear friends, actually, he did a lot for the development of the modern poetry, and his Wasteland is very famous everywhere. And Wasteland, you see, that is a poem described in our syllabus. The Wasteland is a long poem composed by T.S. Eliot. It is widely regarded as one of the most important poems of the 20th century and a central text in modernist poetry, published in 1922. The 434-line poem first appeared in the United Kingdom in the October issue of the Criterion and the United States in the November issue of the Dial. It was published in book form in December 1922. Among its famous phrases are, April is the cruelest month, I will show you fear in a handful of dust, and the mantra in the Sanskrit language, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. It is known for its beautiful lines, it is known for its beautiful composition, and it is also known for its beautiful references from more than, many languages and many writers, of course. Eliot's poem loosely follows the legend of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King, combined with vignettes of the contemporary social condition in British society. Eliot employs many literary and cultural allusions from the Western canon and from Buddhism and the Hindu Upanishads. Because of this, critics and scholars regard the poem as obscure. The poem shifts between voices of satire and prophecy, featuring abrupt and unannounced changes of speaker, location and time, and conjuring of a vast and dissonant range of cultures and literatures. So as we were talking, actually it has got the connotations and references from different languages and writers. The poem's structure is divided into 5 sections. The first section, titled The Burial of the Dead, introduces the diverse themes of disillusionment and despair. The second, titled A Game of Chess, employs vignettes of several characters, alternating narrations that address those themes experientially. The Fire Sermon, the third section, offers a philosophical meditation in relation to the imagery of death and views of self-denial in juxtaposition, influenced by Augustine of Hippo and Eastern religions. After a fourth section that includes a brief lyrical petition, the culminating fifth section, What the Thunder Said, concludes with an image of judgment. So this is how the poem ends actually. It is divided into 5 parts. So T.S. Eliot was a big figure. William Butler Yeats was also a big figure of the modern poetry. and this is how it goes actually. In the next slide, we would like to discuss some other features related to the modern poetry. Thank you.